A storm gathers where the sky forgets to end and the sea forgets to begin. Darkness coils on the horizon like a great slumbering serpent, and somewhere in the hollows of the world's forgotten waters, something ancient exhales. The waves recoil, the air tightens, a silence blooms. Not the silence of peace, but the silence before revelation. This is the Kraken's breath. Long before the oceans were measured, long before names tethered the waves to maps, there were stories. Stories spoken in the hush of midnight watchmen, in the salt-bitten tongues of mariners who had seen too much and lived to whisper about it. They spoke of a creature that did not move through the sea, but became the sea. Its limbs like forests of shadow, its body like a cathedral of flesh. Not a beast, they said, but a memory. A memory of what the sea used to be, wild, wrathful, divine. The Norse called it Hafgufa. Others called it Kraken, but all who named it knew better than to believe the name contained it. It was a force, a mystery garbed in monstrous form, something too vast for the mind to cradle. Sailors carved runes of protection, painted eyes on their ships to trick it, sang songs to lull its hunger. And still sometimes whole ships vanished, not in battle, not in storm, but in stillness, as if pulled gently below by something that wanted no struggle, only silence. Legends grew in the voids where these ships disappeared. Maps blossomed with illustrations of tentacled terrors. Margins filled with warnings. Here be monsters. And perhaps that was true. But the real danger was never the Kraken. It was what it made men feel. Powerless. Insignificant. Confronted by the sheer magnitude of something that was never meant to be understood. But there is another current beneath these tales. Beneath the scales and suckers, beneath the fear and fascination, there lies a different truth. A psychological, even spiritual truth. The Kraken is not merely a monster. It is an archetype, a cipher for all that lies beneath. The things buried, the things denied, the things too big to face. Why does this myth endure? Why, across oceans and centuries, do we still speak of it with awe? Not just because we fear what dwells in the deep, but because we sense that something about the Kraken is profoundly true, not factually, spiritually. Imagine a world without light, a world where the pressure alone could crush steel. That is the world the Kraken inhabits, not just beneath the ocean, but beneath the conscious mind. It is the thing we feel when we look into the dark and realize the dark is looking back. The Kraken is not outside of us. It is within. Ancient mariners, battered by storms and isolation, did not have the language of psychology. They could not speak of trauma or projection or the abyss of the self, but they had stories, and those stories carried a terrifying wisdom, that the sea, like the soul, holds monsters, and that sometimes those monsters rise. This is the mystery we will follow. Not a chronology of sailor tales or zoological guesses, but a deeper pursuit. What does the Kraken reveal about the human mind? What cultural memory birthed it? Why does it feel even now real? To answer this, we must go back, not to the 18th century sightings off Norway's coast, not to the maps of medieval cartographers, but to something older. Older than ink, older than sails, older even than speech. We begin in the mythic north, in the salt-shadowed world of the Vikings, whose longships stitched runes across the sea. They who saw the ocean not as a frontier, but as a god. A living, breathing god, indifferent, immense, hungry. From this sacred terror was born Hafgufa, the sea mist horror, described not just as a beast, but as a presence so vast it could be mistaken for an island. It is here, in these early echoes, that the Kraken first stirs. not as a creature, but as an omen. An omen of what happens when man drifts too far from shore, too far from what is known. And yet, we are drawn to that edge. Again and again, humanity has stood at the shore and gazed outward, not with comfort, but with yearning. The sea beckons like a dream we can never quite remember. Its vastness does not repel, it seduces. That is the Kraken's true lure. It waits not only in the abyss, but in the longing itself, a pull toward the ungraspable, the infinite, the terrible beauty of the unknown. In the Norse sagas, the Hafgufa appears not as a predator in pursuit, but as a stillness so complete that ships mistake it for land. Sailors anchor to its flesh, light their fires upon its back. Only when the beast shifts, when the island begins to breathe, do they realize their fatal error. It is not a landmass. It is alive. This too is metaphor. The illusion of stability, the false ground we claim in the midst of chaos. These tales were not simply cautionary. They were cosmological. For the seafaring Norse, the world was not built upon certainties, but upon the coils of Jörmungandr, the world serpent encircling all creation. The Kraken, in many ways, is kin to this serpent. Not in form, but in function. Both represent boundaries between the seen and the unseen, the safe and the sacred. They are not monsters to be slain, they are thresholds, and thresholds are dangerous. The Kraken appears when the line between what we understand and what we fear begins to blur. It rises from depths not just geographic, but existential. What lies beneath the stories of disappearing ships and drowned sailors is something far more disturbing. The recognition that not all things can be charted, that not all dangers wear a face. By the late Middle Ages, the Kraken had migrated from oral myth into ink and parchment. Sailors' charts began to depict it, tentacled, titanic, always poised near the edges of mapped knowledge. Here, the Kraken flourished not just as a beast, but as a boundary marker. The monstrous as a symbol of limit. Here be monsters was not just a warning, it was a confession, a whispered acknowledgement that knowledge too has its depths. The Enlightenment would try to flatten the sea, to catalog it, to strip it of gods and ghosts. But even in the age of rationality, the Kraken endured. It adapted. No longer described as a mystical being, it became a giant squid, a cryptid, a zoological mystery. But the myth did not die. It merely changed masks. For the sailors of the 18th century, particularly in the waters off Iceland and Norway, the Kraken was reported as real, not legendary. Real men of science wrote cautiously of sea serpents and colossal cephalopods. Yet their language always trembled. Their measurements were inconsistent. The line between myth and marine biology blurred like ink in salt water. And perhaps that was the point. The Kraken was never meant to be proven. It was meant to haunt, to trouble the distinction between reality and myth until we began to question what real even means. Stories persisted. Ships found abandoned, hulls crushed, survivors half-mad with tales of something rising from below. Always from below, always unexpected. And what they described was not just a beast, but an experience. A moment of overwhelming scale. The moment when man, vessel, and story all collapse into silence. This experience is universal. Not the Kraken itself, but the feeling it evokes. That creeping awe in the face of enormity. We feel it on mountaintops, in cathedrals, in dreams where the sky turns black and something vast moves beneath the surface. The Kraken is not a creature. It is an event. An eruption of the unknowable into the fragile fiction of order. And so it endures. It survives because it is true, not factually, but mythically. It names something we need to name: the rupture. The moment when the ground we trusted heaves and we realize it was never ground at all. Only the back of something sleeping. But sleep does not mean stillness. In myth, what slumbers is never gone. It is only waiting. The Kraken, like the unconscious mind, is a force that ebbs and flows, submerged for centuries, then rising suddenly to breach the surface of collective fear. It is not dead. It is dreaming. And sometimes, the dream spills upward into waking life, like brine through broken wood. In the age of exploration, the world grew smaller. Ships multiplied, maps expanded, coastlines became commodities. But with every discovery came disillusionment. The dragon heads were shaved off ships. The rituals fell silent. What had once been a sacred voyage became a transaction. Yet the Kraken remained, looming just beyond the margins of the measurable. It refused to be domesticated. Writers of the Enlightenment tried to fix it in place, to tame the tale, cage it in Latin terms, dissect it like a specimen. But the deeper they looked, the more it slipped through their grasp. A bishop in Bergen wrote of the Kraken in 1752, describing it as so vast that its body resembled a chain of islands, its surfacing capable of dragging entire fleets into the vortex it left behind. He wrote in scientific language, yet what he described was an apocalypse, a theological event cloaked in marine biology. And this is the paradox. The Kraken resists our categories. It is too big to be a beast, too primal to be a god, too specific to be a metaphor, and yet it is all of these at once. Its horror lies not in its form, but in its formlessness, in the way it hovers just past understanding, like a dream half-remembered after drowning. To confront the Kraken is to confront scale itself, the dreadful realization that you are small, and not just small, but irrelevant, that the sea does not know your name, that what rises beneath you does not rise in anger or hunger or malice, but simply rises, because that is its nature. And perhaps this is why sailors, generation after generation, could not let go of the myth. Because deep down, they understood that the ocean was not empty. It was full of things that had never known land, never needed light, never asked permission to exist. The Kraken was their ambassador, a diplomat of the deep, reminding mankind of its boundaries. In some tales, the Kraken is not an attacker, but a consequence. Ships do not anger it, they awaken it. Its presence is not provoked. It is summoned by transgression, by overreaching, by arrogance, by the belief that the sea is ours to claim. It is the punishment of Prometheus made marine. In this light, the Kraken becomes more than a myth. It becomes a mirror. It reflects the psychological deep. What is buried, what is refused, what we push below in the name of control. The Kraken rises not because it chooses to, but because we force it to. We call it forth with our denial. We invoke it with our pride. Even now, in the age of satellites and sonar, we know less about the deep sea than we do about the surface of the moon. This is not a technological failure. It is a mythic truth. The deep is not meant to be known. It is meant to be honored. And those who forget this, who treat the ocean as machine, as map, as mine, risk waking something that remembers otherwise. And so, we return to the old stories, not as relics, but as warnings. When the earth was young, the seas were gods. Now they are merely resources. But myths do not die. They evolve. And when the balance tilts too far, when the old reverence is lost, the Kraken stirs. But what does that stirring mean? Is it the thrash of a physical beast? Tentacles uncoiling in some trench too deep for sun? Or is it the stirring of an older fear? one not located in flesh, but in the trembling root of the human psyche? For to say that the Kraken awakens is also to admit that something within us is awakening too. The myth is not passive. It listens. It waits for a crack in our certainty, a fracture in our mastery, and then it returns. This is the first twist in the tale. The Kraken was never about the sea. It was about us. The ocean in myth is not simply geography. It is the unconscious, the unknowable, the feminine and the formless. And the Kraken is what happens when that suppressed world refuses to stay beneath. It breaks through, terrible, vast, undeniable. For centuries, men spoke of the Kraken as it, a monster, a thing. But if we step back, if we listen instead of classify, another image emerges. One that is older, one that has been buried. In the ancient world, the sea was not ruled by monsters. It was a womb, a goddess, a place of origin. And the beasts within it were not enemies but expressions, limbs of a divine totality too immense for human names. What if the Kraken is not a devil? What if it is a dethroned deity? There are echoes of this heresy in nearly every tradition. In Mesopotamia, Tiamat, the primordial chaos serpent of the sea, is slain by Marduk to create the world. In Hebrew myth, Leviathan is shackled by God until the end of days. In Norse prophecy, Jörmungandr will rise from the ocean and poison the skies at Ragnarok. Again and again, the same pattern. Sea beast as cosmic antagonist, but also as origin, as mother. This is no accident. Myth is not random. It records trauma, transformation, taboo, and there is a pattern here, an erasure, a turning of the sea from sacred to savage, a retelling that transforms goddesses into monsters, chaos into threat, the deep into something to be conquered. The Kraken, then, may be a remnant, a last ripple of that original reverence, distorted through centuries of fear and domination. We did not kill the Sea Mother. We buried her beneath names like Kraken and Leviathan, clothed her in the skin of a predator, and cast her into the abyss. But the abyss remembers. And this is the true rupture. Not that a beast rises from the deep, but that it carries with it the weight of what was lost. The Kraken becomes a revenant, not just a phantom of drowned ships, but of drowned truths. Forgotten ways of seeing the world, of relating to mystery not as enemy, but as teacher. It is not only the monster that terrifies, it is what the monster implies. That the order we have built is not final, that something older and greater is watching, and so the myth doubles back on itself. We feared the Kraken because it devoured, because it pulled us down. But perhaps it was not devouring, it was reclaiming, calling its children home, rebalancing a story that had tilted too far toward conquest. That is the second twist. The Kraken does not hate us. It grieves us. It grieves what we have forgotten, what we have severed. The sea once fed our bodies and our myths. Now we fill it with noise, with waste, with war. We do not listen anymore. We only chart. But myths have long memories. And when the world forgets the sea's true name, the Kraken rises, not as punishment, but as reminder. But reminders are rarely gentle. The Kraken does not tap softly at the stern. It erupts. It tears. It demands attention in the language of collapse. In mythic logic, the gods do not whisper, they roar. And the Kraken is not a lesson in comfort, but in awe. The kind of awe that bends the spine and widens the eye. The kind of awe that leaves you shipwrecked and changed. This is why the Kraken's presence is so paradoxical. It is both terror and revelation. It destroys not to annihilate, but to unveil, to strip away the brittle illusions of mastery, progress, and control that civilization drapes over the deep. What it reveals is not just the fragility of ships and sailors, but the fragility of stories, of meaning, of the neat little borders we draw to keep the chaos out. For all our technology, for all our dominion over land and sky, we remain helpless in the face of the ocean's oldest truths. One moment, a vessel glides over glassy calm. The next, it is gone, swallowed not by storm or reef, but by something that leaves no trace, no evidence, only a silence too complete to explain. These vanishings still haunt maritime lore. Even today, with GPS and sonar and satellite mapping, ships disappear, planes vanish, sonar pings fall into nothing. The Bermuda Triangle, the Dragon's Triangle, modern names for ancient fears. And though we speak now in terms of methane vents or electromagnetic interference, the feeling remains the same. Something stirs, something takes, and we do not understand why. In this absence of understanding, myth returns. The Kraken slips back into the story, not as a literal beast, but as an archetypal placeholder for the unknowable. It stands in the space where explanation fails, and in doing so, it keeps the mystery alive. It guards the threshold. But what if the Kraken's purpose is not to obscure, but to initiate? What if it drags us down not to kill us, but to baptize us? In many spiritual traditions, descent is necessary for transformation. Jonah in the belly of the whale, Inanna passing through the 7 gates, Psyche plunged into the underworld. Each must descend before they can ascend. Each must be unmade before they are reborn. The Kraken, then, becomes a gatekeeper of the abyss. Not an enemy, but an ordeal. It forces the soul to confront what lies beneath. Fear, helplessness, the vastness of being. It tears the ship apart, so that something older than the ship, something unnameable, might surface. That is why the Kraken cannot be found, hunted, or killed, because it is not a thing. It is a passage, a movement, from surface to depth, from illusion to reality, from self to soul. And this passage is as terrifying as it is necessary, because the abyss is not empty. It is full of forgotten gods, repressed memories, ancestral grief. The Kraken is the moment those buried things come back. It is the surge of the subconscious, the primal swell that breaks the surface when we dare to look too deep. It is here, in the mythic function of the Kraken, that we begin to glimpse its true face, not as monster, but as messenger. It speaks in storms. It answers questions we did not know we were asking. It emerges when we are ready, or perhaps when we are not, but always when something must change. So let us no longer ask what the Kraken is. Let us ask instead, what does the Kraken want? It does not want gold. It does not want blood. It does not want territory or worship. The Kraken is not a villain in a tale of conquest. It is the tide that washes away the narrative itself. What it wants, if wanting is even the right word, is honesty. It demands a reckoning, a peeling back of illusions until only the raw and trembling truth remains. And truth, in the Kraken's domain, is not linear. It is not ordered or safe. It swirls. It churns. It arrives in images, in symbols, in dreams soaked with salt. This is why no one can agree on what the Kraken looks like. Some say it has eyes like lanterns. Others say it has none. Some feel only the pull, the void beneath the keel, the breathless moment before the plunge. It is not a shape. It is a presence, a gravitational pull toward the forgotten. In this sense, the Kraken resembles a dream. Not the kind we craft in daylight, but the kind that visits in the witching hour, where time warps and boundaries bleed. Carl Jung called this realm the unconscious. a dark ocean where archetypes swim like ancient fish. And deep within that water lies the shadow, the part of us we do not see, cannot face, dare not name. The Kraken, in Jungian terms, is shadow given form. It is the part of the world and the self that has been repressed. Our fear of the feminine, of nature's chaos, of death, of formlessness. Our terror of not being in control. It appears when the ego falters, when our crafted identities begin to crack beneath the weight of something vaster. To encounter the Kraken, then, is to encounter the limit of the self, the point at which the I dissolves into sea, into myth, into everything that cannot be held. And yet, what emerges from that dissolution is not always despair. Sometimes it is renewal, because in the belly of the whale, something changes. The ego dies, but the soul begins to speak. The Kraken swallows, not to destroy, but to dissolve. It returns us to the womb of mystery, where new meaning may form. Consider the recurring motif, the swallowed hero, Jonah, Geppetto, the prophet Eunice. Each is taken, each enters the depths, each emerges transformed. The Kraken becomes a crucible, a dark initiation. It does not kill, it rebirths. This changes everything. If the Kraken is a monster, then we must flee it. But if it is a midwife of transformation, then the fear it evokes is sacred. It is the fear we feel before surrender, before the old self shatters and something older, wilder, and more truthful is born. Perhaps that is what the Kraken wants. Not our obedience, not our sacrifice, but our surrender. A surrender to the unknown, to the deep, to the part of the world and the part of ourselves that we have tried too long to ignore. And so we begin to see why the Kraken has never died, why its story surges through every age. It survives because it is true, not in the way that facts are true, but in the way that symbols endure. It touches a nerve older than language, a longing to return, a fear of what we might become, a hope that beneath all the terror, something vast still loves us, enough to shake us awake. But awakening is never comfortable. It is a rupture of certainty. And this perhaps is why the Kraken returns again and again, not because it is summoned by sin, but because it is needed. Because we forget. We always forget. The ocean of the mind darkens, the rituals fade, the soul drifts into shallow waters. And so the Kraken comes, not to punish, but to remind us that we are deeper than we know. To be shaken awake is to be torn from the surface. The ego resists. The intellect clings to charts and instruments, but the myth cares nothing for those. The Kraken rises when intellect fails, when the heart grows hollow and the spirit cracks with dryness. It does not wait for permission. It breaches when we are most brittle, when the lies we've told ourselves begin to split at the seams. This is the old rhythm: forgetting, rupture, return. It is the cycle of myth, the motion of tides, the very breath of the earth. Even in ancient cultures, the Kraken's cousins appear again and again under different names: Behemoth, Taniwa, Cetus, Tarask. Always from the water, always immense, always challenging the hubris of those who pretend the sea is silent. But the sea has always spoken. The Kraken is simply its voice in a language older than words. When we drift too far into arrogance, into mechanization, into desecration, the ocean calls us back, not with pleas, but with presence, with the overwhelming sensation that something watches from the deep, not with malice, with memory. And that memory runs deeper than history. Before we named the continents, before we laid borders like scars across the body of the world, before gods were given faces, there was the sea, There was the pulse of life in the womb of water, and there was the Kraken, or something like it. Not yet a monster, but a mythic rhythm, a surge of the unknowable rising in response to human forgetfulness. This is why the Kraken terrifies us, not because it is alien, but because it is intimate. It knows us. It echoes us. It is the part of the cosmos that reflects back our enormity and our fragility. It shows us what we are capable of dreaming, fearing, becoming. It is not just the abyss that looks back. It is us, and yet we cannot destroy it. All attempts to contain the Kraken, to render it fiction, to dismiss it as outdated lore, fail in the end, because the deep cannot be silenced. It finds new forms, new stories. It surges through literature, through nightmares, through film, through the trembling hush that falls when someone says, "There's something in the water." Even our modern myths, those of nuclear submarines, abyssal creatures, rogue waves, vanished signals, they are Kraken stories retold in modern dress. The form changes. The fear remains. The longing, too. The longing to believe that something ancient still lives beneath our mastery, watching, waiting, whispering through the salt. And so the Kraken becomes not only a symbol of terror, but of continuity, of the thread that binds our ancestors to us. The same awe, the same trembling, the same hope that we have not severed all ties to the sacred unknown, that there are still mysteries that refuse to shrink beneath our gaze. It waits. That is its final power. It does not need to act. Its very being unsettles. Its silence thunders. Its shadow once glimpsed is never forgotten. And yet, we try to forget. We always try. We flood the oceans with light, with sonar, with nets that drag the depths like blind fingers. We name the sea lanes. We build rigs and cables. We trace every curve of the continental shelf. But the Kraken cannot be mapped, because it does not live in geography. It lives in the wound of forgetting itself. To glimpse the Kraken is to confront something that resists closure. There is no final chapter, no locked vault, no last word. It is myth in its purest form, endless, self-renewing, beyond our grasp but not beyond our reach. It dwells at the edges of understanding, just out of sight, like a truth too large for the mind but too familiar for the heart to deny. And that may be the deepest reason why the Kraken endures. Not as creature, not even as symbol, but as aperture, a tear in the surface of the world through which a greater awareness floods in. Awareness of scale, of mystery, of what it means to live not above the earth, but inside it. The Kraken teaches humility, not through sermons, but through magnitude. This perhaps is the lesson we fear the most, that we are not separate, that the ocean is not a backdrop, but a mirror, that the myths we cast into the sea return to us, not to haunt, but to awaken. When we stare into the depths and imagine monsters, we are not creating fiction. We are decoding memory, ancestral, cellular, spiritual memory, because the Kraken is not a myth confined to the icy waters of Scandinavia. Its shape appears across the globe, morphing with each culture's tide. The Maori speak of the teweke, a vast octopus whose tentacles stretch across time. In Inuit tales, the kalupalik lures children into the sea with an eerie humming. In West Africa, there are stories of Mamlambo, the river goddess, whose serpentine form undulates beneath still waters. Different names, same shadow. And always, the pattern repeats. The warning not to stray too far, not to desecrate the sacred, not to believe the surface is all there is. These myths do not preach. They pulse. They live. They echo, like sonar, through the collective soul. vibrating the bones with truths that logic cannot touch. In this light, the Kraken is not only a being, it is a boundary. It marks the place where language ends and intuition begins, where explanation fails and something more primal takes hold. It is not there to terrify. It is there to signal that we've arrived at the edge of something vast, the shore of the soul's deep ocean. And so, in our stories, we return to it. Again and again, we repaint it, reinterpret it, rename it, but we do not erase it. We cannot, because the Kraken is not bound to the past. It is the future too. It waits in every dive we take into the unknown, in every surrender to forces larger than the self. It waits in grief, in awe, in love too deep for language. To encounter it is not to die. It is to dissolve, and from that dissolution, to be made whole again, not as we were, but as we were meant to be, aligned with the ancient rhythm. Humbled, yes, but also expanded. That is the paradox. The Kraken brings collapse, but through collapse we awaken. But awaken into what? What kind of world waits on the other side of the myth, once the monster has risen and the waves have settled? To understand that, we must look not to the depths, but to the reflection. The way the Kraken, like all enduring myths, mirrors back not just terror, but transformation. What it shatters is not merely ships, but certainties. And what it leaves behind is something strangely luminous, the broken pieces of an old self, glinting like sea glass on the tide. This is the second major inversion in the tale. The Kraken is no longer merely a creature of horror, nor simply a spiritual gatekeeper. It is the architect of the threshold itself. It does not wait in the dark. It constructs the dark. It fashions the descent. It designs the very conditions through which meaning might be reborn. And that design is not cruel. It is sacred. In this interpretation, the Kraken becomes a divine function, a sacred destroyer. Like Kali in the Hindu tradition or Sekhmet in Egyptian myth, it is the embodiment of creative annihilation, the principle that nothing new can emerge without the old being undone. This is not sadism. This is cosmic law. The wave does not ask if the shore is ready. It breaks. The forest does not mourn the fire. It regrows. And so the Kraken enters myth not just as a warning, but as a necessity, a force of renewal that arrives clothed in dread, because only dread is strong enough to tear us from illusion. We do not change when we are safe. We change when we are undone. But if this is true, if the Kraken is transformation disguised as terror, then its appearances in culture take on new meaning. Think of how we speak of sea change, of storms of life, of being adrift or cast out. These are not just metaphors. They are fragments of a deeper story encoded in our language. They are modern echoes of the ancient voice that once called the Kraken by name. And that voice is not extinguished. It speaks still, though we may not hear it above the hum of engines and algorithms. It calls in dreams, in deep grief, in those strange moments of stillness where the world feels too vast and the self too small. It stirs when we stand at the edge of what we know, when a job ends, when a belief crumbles, when a loved one dies. These are the modern surfacings of the mythic sea. In those moments, we feel the pull, not toward death, but toward depth, toward something older than language, wiser than doctrine, something that is not here to comfort, but to initiate. The Kraken, again. And perhaps that is the most radical idea of all, that the Kraken does not rise to frighten us, but to welcome us, not to punish, but to guide. That every story of its terror is, beneath the surface, a disguised ritual of return. a mythic map back to the waters we once called sacred. To see this is to feel the terror dissolve into awe, to realize that what we feared as a monster was always a mirror, that what we fled was not the Kraken, but what it asked of us: to let go, to release the surface, to drown, not in water but in truth. And so the myth changes shape again. No longer a beast, no longer a gatekeeper, no longer a punisher, but a priest of the deep, a celebrant of endings, a witness to what is possible when we surrender control. And surrender, true surrender, is a vanishing art. In our age, we are taught to command, to conquer the mountain, master the craft, subdue the chaos. Surrender is mistaken for weakness. But in myth, surrender is power. It is the moment the hero stops resisting the storm and lets the current take him. It is the sacred letting go. And it is there, in that descent, that the Kraken waits, not as jailer, but as guide, for those who survive the mythic sea, who descend into the darkness and return. They do not return unchanged. They carry something back with them, an echo, a vision, a song sung in a language the surface no longer speaks. This is the pattern of the shaman, the mystic, the poet. They go under. They vanish from the world. And when they rise again, they bring the deep with them. This is the secret. No sailor dares name that the Kraken gives gifts, not treasures in the dragon hoard sense, not power, but perspective. The kind that makes a man kneel on dry land and weep for no reason he can explain. The kind that turns kings into wanderers. The kind that rewrites the soul in salt and silence. And these gifts are not given freely. They must be earned. The Kraken demands presence, demands that you feel the crushing pressure, the loneliness, the surrender, that you endure the disorientation of myth, that spiral of unknowing, where direction dissolves and meaning rearranges itself beneath strange stars. It is this very ordeal that separates the Kraken from mere beast. Beasts can be hunted, slain, turned into trophies, but the Kraken is not for the spear. It is for the soul, and the soul cannot be charted, caged, or consumed. It must be courted. It must be witnessed. Witnessing the Kraken is, in essence, witnessing yourself through the eye of eternity. It is the confrontation with scale so immense that your identity unravels. But in the unraveling, something holy is glimpsed. Something that doesn't care about your name, your goals, your neatly kept stories. Something that sees only the eternal in you and welcomes it home. In the old seafarers' legends, those who claimed to have seen the Kraken were not celebrated. They were avoided, regarded as half-mad, touched, not because they lied, but because they had crossed into that mythic current and returned speaking in riddles. Their eyes too wide, their voices changed, they had seen beyond the veil, and the world no longer fit them. Perhaps this is why the Kraken must remain a myth. If we ever did catch it, measure it, pin it to the deck of some research vessel, we would lose everything it means. The mystery would die. And without mystery, we would forget how to transform. And so it resists capture. It resists fact. It dwells in the fog between knowing and unknowing. It hides behind storm and surge, not to elude us, but to preserve itself, to preserve us. For if we kill the Kraken, we kill the deep in ourselves. And if that dies, we drift forever on surfaces, never touching what lies beneath. That is why it must return, not to frighten us, to complete us. Completion, however, does not mean perfection. It means wholeness, the integration of what was lost, exiled, ignored. In this light, the Kraken becomes not the end of the journey, but the axis upon which it turns. It is not the storm itself, but the eye within the storm, the still point that waits for those brave enough to spiral inward, the ones willing to listen to what the monster truly says. And what it says is this: you are not separate. You are not above the water. You are of it. You come from the deep, and to the deep you will return, not as punishment, but as passage. For everything the Kraken destroys, it also reweaves. It unravels illusion only to offer thread. And if you dare, you can begin again, but you must begin from below. This is the sacred arc encoded in the myth, the descent, the death, the reemergence, the spiral down into salt dark chambers where the ego breaks and something older takes root. This is not metaphor. This is the language of the soul, and every culture that has touched the sea has told this story. Only the names change. The function remains. In Polynesian legend, Tangaroa rules the ocean depths, both feared and revered. In Greek myth, the monstrous Scylla and Charybdis guard the passage between worlds. In Celtic lore, the Selkies shed their seal skins and walk as humans until they are called back to the waves. All these tales are variations of the same melody. Do not forget the sea. Do not forget the deep. And above all, do not forget what it costs to become whole. The Kraken ensures we remember, not through didactic teaching, but through rupture, through awe, through the kind of confrontation that leaves no part of the self untouched. It is an old ritual, older than religion. The meeting with the ineffable, the self exposed before a god too vast to name. And so the Kraken asks nothing less than surrender. Not obedience, not faith, but the soft, shaking surrender of the one who lays down their weapons, their masks, their maps. The one who kneels on the deck of a trembling vessel and whispers, "Take me." The one who no longer runs. It is here that the emotional core of the myth emerges. Beneath the waves, beneath the fear, beneath the enormity of it all, there is grief, the grief of separation, the grief of forgetting who we are. And it is this grief that the Kraken holds, cradles, and ultimately returns to us, transfigured. It is not a beast of wrath. It is a guardian of sorrow, a keeper of truths too vast for the surface to bear. In its embrace we are undone, but in that undoing we are known, not as we present ourselves to the world, but as we truly are, fragile, vast, yearning, sacred. To be held by the Kraken is to be held by something that does not flinch at your shadow, something that sees your terror and does not turn away. And when we rise, if we rise, we do so marked. Marked not by the Kraken's malice, but by its memory. We carry its salt in our blood. We speak in softened tones. We walk as though the floorboards beneath us might split and pour forth the sea. We become living myths, reminders to others that the deep is real and it remembers. But memory is a heavy tide. It does not simply lap at the edges of consciousness, it surges. It brings with it not only images and feelings, but lineages, wounds, inheritances unspoken. To be marked by the Kraken is to become a vessel of ancestral waters, a carrier of stories too wide to belong to one life alone. It is to walk with the pressure of oceans behind the eyes and speak in rhythms shaped by salt and silence. In many shamanic traditions, the initiate must be broken open, dismembered in spirit, before they can heal others. This breaking is not cruel. It is sacred, a passage through darkness that strips away the false self so the true one can emerge. The Kraken enacts this dismemberment not with blades, but with revelation. It reveals the vastness within. It reveals how far we've drifted from it. And it asks, without words, will you return? Return not to the surface world of metrics and machines, but to the liminal realm beneath it, to the place where the psyche breathes, where myth is not metaphor, but mirror. This realm has no map. It has only current. And to follow it is to relinquish the compass, to trust the pull of something older than logic. Those who have truly met the Kraken speak differently. Their metaphors are wetter, their silences longer. They do not shout their knowledge. They carry it like a tide within. Their presence is a kind of gravity. Children sense it. Animals too. It is the energy of one who has been claimed by something immense, and who now walks half in this world, half in another. This is the paradox of the Kraken's gift. It isolates and unites at once. The one who is called by it often walks alone, but in their solitude they become a beacon. Others, too, begin to remember, begin to feel the stir beneath the keel of their own stories. The deep begins to murmur again. The myth comes alive. And here lies the final initiation, the realization that the Kraken was never separate from the self, that the terror it brought was not foreign, but familiar, that the abyss was not an other world. It was the innermost world, rising to the surface. All along, the monster was kin. All along, the drowning was a return. This knowledge is unbearable, and yet essential. It shatters the narrative of conquest and mastery that civilization clings to. It says, "You are not the author of the world. You are a ripple in its dreaming, and your task is not to rule, but to remember that the ocean within is as vast as the one without, and that both are sacred." So the Kraken lingers, not as a threat, but as an undertow, a reminder that beneath the noise, beneath the plans and platforms and pipelines, the deep still calls. That myth is not dead, that mystery cannot be conquered, that what we call monster may be the oldest part of ourselves, returning to be heard. And when the tide rises again, when the waters swell, and something ancient stirs, we will know it not by name, but by feeling. A sudden stillness, a hush inside the blood. The knowledge that something enormous has opened its eye in the dark and seen us. To be seen by the Kraken is not to be hunted. It is to be revealed. It is the moment when every mask slips, every armor cracks, and what remains is the soul, bare, luminous, unadorned. There is no hiding in the gaze of the deep, no performance, only recognition, and with it, a strange, unspeakable grace, the grace of being known by something older than time. This moment changes everything. It alters the direction of one's life, not in grand, theatrical gestures, but in the slow shifting of tides. Priorities rearrange, values bend toward the eternal. One begins to speak less, but listen more. The voice within grows louder. Symbols start to whisper. Patterns reveal themselves in the strangest places. In dreams, in ruins, in the curl of sea foam on a forgotten shore. Such is the quiet power of myth, when it is lived rather than told. The Kraken does not need to rise again in monstrous form. Its presence can be felt in subtler ways. The uncanny silence before a storm, the weight of grief too wide for one lifetime, the sudden and inexplicable longing to return to the sea. These are not moods. They are messages. They are invitations. And yet, the modern world offers little room for such invitations. It demands speed, clarity, distraction. It recoils from stillness. But the Kraken waits in stillness. It dwells in the forgotten rhythms, slow tides, ancient chants, the breath of the moon on the ocean's back. To find it again, one must slow down, must become porous, must allow silence to bloom. This is the final paradox, that the greatest truths are not screamed from mountaintops, but whispered beneath the waves. that the most profound awakenings happen not in the noise, but in the hush after the storm. That the Kraken's final gift is not terror or power, but tenderness. A tenderness so vast it overwhelms. A love that sees your smallness and does not demand you grow, but reminds you that even your smallness is sacred. It is in this tenderness that the myth completes its circle. The monster becomes a guardian. The fear becomes reverence. And the deep, once a place of dread, becomes a place of return. We realize the Kraken was never outside us. It was the cry of the soul itself, rising to the surface after too long buried. In this way, the Kraken becomes not just a figure of myth, but a path, a sacred spiral back to the origin. The place before words, before ego, before exile. And those who follow it, who surrender to the deep and rise again, carry something of it within. They are marked, not as cursed, but as called. Called to remember, called to feel, called to speak, in stories that stir the old salt in the blood. And though the world may call them mad or lost or haunted, they know better. They know that to carry the Kraken is to carry the memory of something vast and true, something that watches, something that waits, something that will rise again, not to punish, not to destroy, but to remind us what it means to be whole. But wholeness is not what we think it is. It is not perfection. It is not light without shadow. Wholeness is the embrace of paradox, the holding of opposites in the same trembling hand. The Kraken teaches this by being both terror and tenderness, both abyss and origin. It reminds us that the path to healing wins through contradiction. That true myth does not resolve, it reveals. And here lies the final turn, the deepest inversion of the tale. The Kraken was never a monster. It was a god. Not a god of temples and tithes, but of thresholds. A liminal deity, dwelling in the space between things, in the breath between death and rebirth, in the silence between stories, in the dark water beneath the glittering surface of all we think we know. And like all ancient gods, it demands not belief, but participation. Not worship, but witness. This is the truth, long hidden beneath the scales and tentacles. The Kraken is not a beast at the end of the world, but a gate at the center of the soul. And those brave enough to approach it, to descend, to dissolve, to emerge, become not heroes, but bridges. Living doorways between what is seen and what is sacred. They become the new myth-bearers, the new tellers of the deep. No longer do we ask, does the Kraken exist? That question is too small, too literal. Instead, we ask, where is it moving now? In what form does it rise? Perhaps in the sudden grief that cracks the heart open. Perhaps in the collective dreams that ripple through cultures. Perhaps in the stories, like this one, that will not stay dead. For myth never dies. It only changes shape. And so the Kraken rises not from the sea, but from the soul. It emerges not in the shattering of ships, but in the shattering of certainty. It breaks not bones, but narratives. And what it leaves behind is not ruin, but reverence. This is its final gift. Not transformation, not awakening, but remembrance. Remembrance of the deep, of the feminine, of the dark and fertile places we were taught to fear, of the cycles older than empire, of the songs sung in salt before speech was born, of the gods who do not wear crowns, but currents, of the truth that we are not separate from the storm, we are its echo. The Kraken, then, is not a story of the sea. It is a story of return, to the womb, to the wild, to the part of us that remembers what we were before the world taught us to forget. It waits for no believer. It waits for no map. It waits only for the moment when the surface finally splits, and something immense rises from beneath, not to consume, but to call us home. And when it calls, it does so in silence. Not a void, not an absence, but a pregnant stillness. The kind that descends before birth, before death, before revelation. In that stillness, something ancient hums, a vibration too deep for hearing, too real to be dismissed. It is the voice of the myth itself, pulsing through every era, reshaping itself to match the needs of the human heart. The Kraken is one name among many. In this final telling, it does not matter what form it took in the stories of old: tentacled behemoth, sea demon, god of the threshold. What matters is what it awakens in us. That cold thrill at the edge of the known, that gravitational pull toward the mysterious, that aching remembrance that we were once more than these roles, these routines, these cages of certainty. To heed the Kraken's call is not to abandon the world, but to re-enter it, changed, softened, humbled, empowered not by domination, but by surrender. Those who carry its memory do not seek conquest. They seek coherence. They listen more. They laugh more softly. They love with the awareness that everything, even terror, is a teacher. Even endings are entrances. The final paradox is this: the Kraken was never meant to be understood. It was meant to be met. And in that meeting, to dissolve the false border between self and sea, between myth and mind, between story and soul, to let go of needing answers and instead become a vessel for the question itself. The question that has haunted every shore, every story, every seeker who ever dared to dive deeper than they were told was safe. Who waits for us beneath the waves? And the answer, whispered in darkness, is not a name, but a knowing. A feeling in the blood that says, you are not alone. You never were. Something vast and ancient remembers you. Something with no shape but shadow, no face but the mirror of your own awe. Something that was never a monster, only a mystery. The Kraken does not end. It opens. A portal, a passage, a possibility. It leaves no relics behind, only ripples. And those ripples move through culture, through language, through generations, calling us back, not to fear, but to wonder. And in the end, perhaps that is the greatest truth of all, that monsters are not what they seem, that the things we fear most may be the very forces trying to bring us home, that the ocean does not rise to punish, but to remember, and that beneath the crashing waves, beneath the myths and maps and centuries of forgetting, something vast and sacred still waits for us, to see, to feel, to become. Thank you for sailing with me into the mythic sea and listening to the true, forgotten tale of the Kraken. These stories are not relics, they are rituals, living threads that bind us to our deeper selves and to the wisdom of those who came before. If this journey stirred something in you, some ancient memory, some hidden longing, I invite you to follow where it leads. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to keep exploring these myths reborn. And as always, thank you for your presence in the deep.